Well, good morning, and thank you for taking this time to be with us today. Today we have the privilege of celebrating 75 years as a missionary church. And so today we're going to take a little bit of a look back at the history of the missionary church. But don't worry, if you're not a person that's into history, it's not going to be all about history. I understand that some people, history is a very boring thing for them to learn about. But I do know other people, they love history and connecting that history to the present. And so we're going to try to balance that a little bit. And it's really important to look back at the history of the missionary church because of what our goal is today. And it's about restoring a legacy. And in order to restore something, you have to know where your founding is at. And so I wanted to take some time, look back at the missionary church. What did we come from? And see about what we can learn about that history that can ignite us to be able to move forward in the task that God has given us today to be doing. I've grown a lot in my research and reading of the missionary church, some things that I've learned that I want to work on myself, that I've gleaned from the people that's come before us in this movement at Sturgis Missionary Church, and I hope it's something that can encourage you this week as well. So a little bit of a background on Sturgis Missionary Church. It started back when the Nuswander family, they were called to missions in the Dominican Republic, but they're waiting for their time to be sent to the DR. And so during that time, they didn't want to just sit back and wait for that. They wanted to be doing the Lord's work while they waited. And so they really wanted to be doing work here in the States as they waited. And so on their way to meet some family over in Niles, they stopped by Sturgis and really felt a sense that this would be a great place to establish a missionary church. And so it was about a month later that the leadership of the missionary church denomination came down to Sturgis as well, looked over the area, and they agreed that this was a good idea. And the Nuswander family was chosen to be the church planners to go embark on this endeavor. So in September 1944, 4 months after the D-Day landing, the newspapers would have been filled about these V-2 rockets that were launched on London and Paris by the Germans. And it was the first successful operation with these new kind of rockets. And though the papers wouldn't have been talking about it at the time, this is the same time that Anne Frank was sent to Auschwitz, the concentration camp. And it was during this time that a group of 14 individuals were meeting together to pray in the Ettlings' home about establishing a church in Sturgis. It wasn't long until these 14 people, they outgrew the Ettlings' home, and so they had to look for another place to meet as a congregation, and so they chose the Carnegie Library in Sturgis and asked them if they could meet. And there's great writings of the wonderful ladies at the library and how they helped the church and were accommodating to the church as they met there for the next few months. And so the church at this point, it grew to 26 individuals that were meeting at first at the library. And it was in April of 1945 that they outgrew the library. And so they decided they need to find another place to meet. And so they bought land on Hatch Street that was a residency of a home. And so they remodeled it to make it into a church that they could meet into. But it wasn't long into this remodeling phase that the missionary church, Sturgis Missionary Church, got some bad news. The Nuswander family, they were called to go to the DR, the Dominican Republic, to do their missionary work that they first intended to do. This was heart-wrenching for the missionary church, but they knew that was God's original intention for the Nuswanders, and that they were there to get this missionary church established. And so it was at this time that A.D. Randall became pastor of Sturgis Missionary Church, which still was just a group of people that were meeting together to study God's Word. So during his pastorate, during the time that the military, the U.S. military, was having briefings over an atomic bomb run that they were going to have over Hiroshima in 4 days, Sturgis Missionary Church was organized as an affiliate of the Missionary Church with 26 members. Their first year, they had 40 people that was a part of this church. And their annual funds that they brought in as a church was just under $4,000. To put that in perspective, that is about the average of what the missionary church brings in now per week. And that was their whole yearly budget. In 1949, there would have been news in the papers of this first nonstop flight around the world. There would have been the remarks of the invention of the electron microscope. Silly putty was first introduced in America, and Americans were buying 100,000 TVs per week. And it was at this time that they had to put on the addition to the Hatch Street house, giving it that modern look that you can see today still at 202 East Hatch Street. I think it's interesting now, this wasn't meant to be, but to look back at the buildings that the Sturgis Missionary Church started off in is kind of a neat symbolism of our journey with Christ. It started off in the Etling's home, and that's where the gospel starts off, is in our homes. It's a part of our lives. And from there they moved on to the library, and it reminds me of the Christian walk as one of critical thinking, of scholarship. Paul tells us to think about these things, to reason about our faith, and the library is a great illustration of that, of scholarship and thinking through ideas. And so that's kind of that next step in a person's walk. The gospel comes into their home, and so then they have to advance their knowledge of who God is. But you don't just stay there. Christianity isn't a head knowledge thing. And so what does the church do? They go into another home. Right? The first official church building is a home that is renovated into a church. And it's a great reminder of how, God's Word, it's a part of our homes, and it transforms our home lives into a sanctuary. And if you've ever drove by the building there on Hatch Street, you'll notice the front of it, that addition that they made, kind of has this castle look to it. And I think that's just a great culmination of what our walk is with Christ. It's our home and it's our worship, but then there's this kingdom living that comes into our lives, and there's the promised kingdom and millennial reign of Christ that is yet to come, and that is a great symbolism in the church building, having that castle look on the front of it. So I think that's a neat symbolism that's in our past as Sturgis Missionary Church. Not that it was meant to be that. That wasn't the reason why all those things were in those places, but it's kind of neat on the front side, or on the back side, looking forward into it. And then it was in 1986 that they would have purchased the land that Sturgis Missionary Church sits on presently. They've at first acquired 6 acres for $20,000 there. And then in '89, the year that Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Back to the Future 2, and Little Mermaid were popular, that is when they broke ground to start building our current facility that we have now, or our sanctuary. And it was in '91 that they would have bought the extra land, an extra 4.5 acres about, for another $29,000. And then in 1992, when again the newspaper articles would be talking about the launch of Columbia 13, a meteorite that came and destroyed a family's 1980 Chevrolet Malibu that was sitting in their driveway in Penskill, New York. And at the time that the first World Series was held that had no U.S. teams playing in it, we had the groundbreaking for our educational wing for Sturgis Missionary Church. And then it was in August of 1995 that the education wing was in use. So thank you to Beth Gehrig and the late Dale Gehrig, for Luane and Pauline Hershey and Diana Schrock for all the work and effort they put into researching the history of Sturgis Missionary Church back for its 50th anniversary. And it was through their writings and their collaboration of the research that they did that really helped lay out this groundwork that I was able to read to you today. So that leads us to what today's message is all about, of this restoring a legacy. What is a legacy? What is it important to know about the history of Sturgis Missionary Church? A legacy is something that we're called to leave a positive imprint on the world. But as Christians, it's not just about leaving a legacy. We do want to do that. We want to have that positive imprint on the world, but we also want to leave that positive imprint in a Christian manner that has to do with our religion. That is part of our calling. So a Christian legacy is leaving behind what we have learned. We don't want to just hold in what we have learned and not pass it on to future generations, but that is part of the discipleship call, is to pass on what we have learned to the next generations. So we're called to this kingdom living, right? To be living out the life that Christ has called for us, to spread the praise and glory of who God is, and to disciple others. And this is all throughout the Bible, but the main gist of where we get this and our call for a legacy is in the Great Commission that we read of in Matthew 28, verses 19 through 20. Where we go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, to the end of the age. When it comes to our call as Christians, I like what David Platt has to say. He says, we can either die in our religion or die in our devotion. A reminder that we can walk this earth and just have been a Christian and that's it. Or we can walk this earth and have kingdom living principles and to be leaving a legacy and have died in our devotion, having done something, having been a part of God as He's established His kingdom on this earth. See, we said a legacy is leaving something behind for the next generation, but let's take it one step further. A legacy is not just something taught. It must be lived out by the one who is leaving it. It can't just be through words. I want to look at two individuals that we find in the Bible that have legacies. And one is pretty weak, if we could even call it a legacy at all. The first one's Pekah. He was a king of the northern tribe of Israel. And we read about him in 2 Kings chapter 15, verses 27 through 31. We're told that he reigns for 20 years over Israel. That's longer than any missionary church pastor has been over Sturgis Missionary Church. So 20 years, that's a long time to be reigning. Then we're given some details of what happened during his reign. Not details that are important to him. It doesn't mention him, just things that happened during the time of his reign. And then we're told at the end how he died. And that's all we're given of Pekah. It's not much different than what you'd read out of headstone. This is when they were born, and this is when they died. The details, again, that we're given of his life have nothing to do with him, just what was going on in that era during that time. There just was nothing the Holy Scriptures could really write about with this individual. He just lived and died. Compare that to Mordecai that we read about in the book of Esther. Esther having no parents, Mordecai adopts his cousin Esther. And when Esther goes into the harem of the king, we read of how every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was. He took care of her still. He made sure that she was doing well during those times. When Mordecai heard of plans to assassinate the king, he made sure that he revealed that news to somebody who could tell the king. When Haman wanted homage paid to him and wanted people to bow down to him, Mordecai refused to do that because as a Jew he had the convictions that he was to honor God alone, and to pay homage to anybody else would be idolatry. And so he held strong to his convictions. Now Haman, when he learned of this, was very upset, and so he decided, since Mordecai was a Jew, he wanted all Jews destroyed. And so when Mordecai learned of this, he didn't just become angry about it, but we read of Mordecai mourning and crying out for the wickedness of Haman. He took it serious and realized that there was great pain and heartache that would come from that. And so we see a heart like God's heart through Mordecai, through that account. And then Esther has an opportunity to step in of the position she's in with the palace. And so Mordecai goes to Esther with two important things. He comes to her with a warning, and he comes to her with an encouragement. And this is so important. He has to tell her that, Esther, the road that you are going down is dangerous. She doesn't want to take a step out to help her people because she knows that it's dangerous if she does so. So Mordecai has to warn her, if you refuse to move, something bad could happen. But he doesn't just leave it at that. He tells her then, here's the encouragement you can have if you go forward and do the thing that's really hard to do. It's an important thing with counsel, with somebody who is doing something wrong, to warn them, but to encourage them in what is good to do. So, we read three things that he tells Esther during this time, and the first one is the warning. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. So he warns us, just because of your position, Esther, doesn't mean you're not going to suffer death as a Jew. And then the second thing that he tells her, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. So here he has both an encouragement and a warning, warning her again that her and her father's house will perish even though she's in the palace. But he gives her hope, saying, the Jewish people will be delivered. If not from you, Esther, somebody else will rise up. That Esther, you cannot hold back God's will. And it's a great reminder to you and I as well. There will be times that we fail maybe what we felt God was calling us to do. Do not hold the responsibility on yourself that you've withheld God's will from ever happening on this earth. You are not that powerful. God will make his will come out through another individual then. You just missed the opportunity to be a part of it. So God encourages Esther there, going, this all doesn't weigh down on your shoulders. God will make his will be done. And the third thing he gives there is the strongest encouragement he's given yet, and I think it's a powerful encouragement for anybody. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai reminds her, Esther, maybe you are where you're at because God destined you to be there at this time, at this place, to be his deliverer. What great warning and encouragement Mordecai gives to Esther, and it works. It does. It motivates her to go out and do the hard thing, to ask to be in the king's presence, even though she hasn't been invited. And that might mean death for Esther. But this warning encouragement Mordecai gives her pushes her to go and do the hard thing. We go on then and read that Mordecai didn't just leave it at that and put all the responsibility on Esther, but he gets a group of people together and says, we need to fast and pray for this meeting that Esther is going to have, because it is a dangerous situation she's going into. And so he does great on still being a part of what Esther's doing, even though he can't physically be there. And then through the rest of the account of Esther, we read of the rise of prominence that Mordecai has. We read of the tactic that he has then to save the Jews because of what Haman has just got signed as a decree for the Jews to be killed. And so Mordecai comes up with this plan of here's how we can save the Jewish people. And through that, it works really well. And a new holiday is celebrated with the Jews of Purim because of the work that Mordecai did in the salvation of the Jewish people during that time. And at the end of the book of Esther in chapter 10, in the latter part of verse 3, we read this about Mordecai. And he was great among the Jews, and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people, and spoke peace to all his people. Now that is a legacy. That is something that was carried on and handed down to future generation. It was something that was lived out in the life of Mordecai to be handed out into future generations. Way different than we read about Pekah, right? If he reigned this long, this is what happened during his reign. It has nothing to do with him, and then he died. Mordecai, we have all these things that he put into those that were around him and future generations can learn from. That's what we're called to do as Christians as well, is to leave this legacy. And so this is an opportunity as we look back at 75 years of Sturgis Missionary Church to say, what can we learn from those who went before us to leave this legacy ourselves? Is there areas that we need to motivate ourselves to do? So when history looks back at us, it doesn't just say, they were part of Sturgis Missionary Church this long, and then they died. But is there something of value that we've given to the body of believers? Maybe it's not written in church documents or something like that, but what is it that we leave with individuals or the Lord himself when we stand before the throne and we can know in our minds, this is the legacy that we left. And maybe there's a part where we need to restore that, revive that inside ourselves to say, hey, I want to be a part of what God is doing right now. I don't want to die in my religion. I want to die in my devotion, as David Platt said. So a legacy. One of the purpose statements that I read of the missionary church back in its past was mobilizing God's people to glorify him by building the body and winning the world for Christ. And I thought that's so cool because that's exactly the same, just worded different. So I guess I can't say exactly. It's the same principle as what we have today, right? Our mission statement, know, love, and follow. A simplified version of what that says. Our vision statement now of a devoted community of believers, rooted, built up, walking with Christ in worship, making disciples, preaching the gospel so all acquaintances have heard, and no believers left without a church home. Same thing as what I just read of that came from our past. It's just worded differently and has a little bit more details into it to say how we're going to navigate that out. It's funny looking back at the purpose statements and things like that of the missionary church. Again, they all kind of say the same thing. You know, you would think that we're almost all preaching from the exact same book and have the same calling onto our lives and have the same calling as an organization, as a church that we're all trying to follow, right? It would make sense that they all are connected with one another. But it's neat specifically for our church of how closely they are connected with the wording with one another. When it comes to this leaving a legacy, I like what Warren Wiersbe has to say. When you serve your own generation faithfully, you also serve future generations. I think that is well stated by Warren Wiersbe. And it's well stated because it comes directly from the Bible. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 17, we read, "He who does the will of God abides forever." And yes, we dwell for eternity with Christ, but also the ministry that we do carries on to the next generation. And I think that's what Warren Wiersbe is trying to get at here. And when we serve faithfully the generation that we're living in now, it's going to continue on into future generations. That's what leaving a legacy is all about. To leave a legacy can look like many different facets. And we're going to look at a couple of those in closing. Leaving a legacy can enrich God's people for centuries, right? It's exactly what Warren Wiersbe said. If we're serving faithfully now, it's going to continue on to other generations. And I think of this with the memories that were shared at Pastor Bob's retirement, of people sharing how Pastor Bob was there for them in the really hard times. And the times that people shared of how Pastor Bob was with them during the great times of, their baptisms, of their weddings in different areas like that. Pastor Bob connected with people in a way that continues on into the future. Pastor Bob taught people things that they are teaching now their children, and they're teaching people that they're discipling of things that they learned from Pastor Bob. He helped leave a legacy of carrying on to future generations. I think of John Tittman's connections of when I read church documents of the writings that he had wrote, but also what people wrote about him and how he was able to make connections with individuals that carry on to today, but also he connected the church together in ways that connected new groups and established newcomers who visited the church to want to stay in Sturgis Missionary Church as their church home. Another form of leaving a legacy is setting an example of Christian behavior, of being that image of who Christ is, especially when we struggle in a certain area. To see somebody who excels in that area that we struggle with can be such a great benefit. And I came across this with the Ettlings, the people who we first met as a missionary church in their home in 1944, before the library. Beth Gehrig, when she wrote about the church history, or rewrote his basically writing, she said that he was such a humble individual. He was such a part of the establishment of Sturgis Missionary Church. But you don't read that in his writing. He spoke about the Newswanders and Randall and emphasized them and put a back seat to him and his family. A great example of humility, of putting the focus on other people and the great work that they have done. So what a great example of a Christian character to exemplify. Leaving a legacy is a source of encouragement to those that are around you, and again can pass on to future generations. Ruth Newswander, so she was the wife of the first pastor of the missionary church, the family that went to the Dominican Republic. This is what she wrote for the congregation when they were celebrating their 50th anniversary. Many times we were invited out to dinner in one of the homes, or we had several at our homes for a meal. This, I hope, has continued. And the encouragement that we get from Ruth there, to say, the missionary church, Sturgis Missionary Church, was established on fellowship around a meal in people's homes. And she says, boy, I hope this carries on into the future of the church as well. This is what built Sturgis Missionary Church. And I don't know as though Maggie and Craig Bolthouse and Andy and Linda Phillips knew this history of Sturgis Missionary Church, but it's cool that God put that same passion on those individuals, with Maggie and Craig doing the supper clubs and the Phillips doing promoting the block parties to get together or to get to know our communities, of carrying on this tradition of how we were even founded as a church. And I hope that is something that we continue to strive to do, to be able to be meeting in each other's homes, just to share fellowship with one another in the meal sense. Leaving a legacy can be a spiritual motivation. I came across Pastor Dennis Owen's motto of a church on a move at an important time as they transitioned from the Hatch Street location to our present location of where we're at now. Dennis Owen being kind of the pastor, I would say, that looks like during the heydays of Sturgis Missionary Church, when it was the biggest at its time, and the motivation he had for the people to put in the hard work that was needed to be moving to a new location. I've seen this in Pastor Paul Woods' writings, in his reports and things that he wrote. It was amazing how he could take what Pastor Chris Knight was encouraging the church to do, and Paul would jump on board with that and would motivate the people to get on board with what Pastor Chris was doing. Just an amazing gift to do that. It looked like Pastor Chris was a great relational guy, and Paul had the logic and the facts and the details for it, and he could bring that alongside to say, here's what Pastor Chris wants to do, and here's why we should get behind it and do it. He was a great motivator in the things that we should do as a church. Leaving a legacy is a great source of knowledge and wisdom. And I've seen this in Pastor Chris Knight. He was ahead of his time. The things that I read about what Chris Knight wanted to do, I laughed going, that's the things that they're telling us now to be doing as a church. And he was doing that in the early 2000s. He was ahead of his time, and he helped the church work through those things that looked like it was difficult at the time, but he seen that this was the area that the church needed to go to next to reach people into the culture. And so he had that knowledge and that wisdom that he was sharing. I seen this with Skip Bowersocks and his creative thinking that he had. and he partnered with Paul Woods on this, but Skip's idea to understand that we need this central connection spot when people come into the church so that they feel comfortable and they don't have to feel like they're shoved off into another building to have fellowship, but it's just natural right here. And we should have this one central location where all of our information is shared for people to get. And again, I thought that was cool because I'm like, wow, that's exactly what Anna Camburn has been telling our church when she came in, going, we need to centralize all of our information so it's super simple for everybody to get. There's one place to go and get your information. Like, this is nothing new. This is something our church was already doing. It's just the avenues to gather this information is different. We're in a more technical age now. And so it looks different, but the concept was exactly the same as what was established back with Chris Knight, Paul Woods, and Skip Bowersox. And so again, it's neat how the ideas are still working out the same. It's just the methods look a little bit different because of how culture has changed. And then lastly, to leave a legacy is to lay the groundwork for those who will carry on the work after them. And an example I seen with this with Sturgis Missionary Church's history was from the late Pastor Dale Garrett. He came into Sturgis Missionary Church when it had been closed down for 3 weeks because a pastor left suddenly. So the church had some special services right afterwards, and then it shut down for 3 weeks. And Pastor Dale Garrett came in, and there was only a dozen individuals about that came to the first service that he had. And some of those were friends of theirs that came with them. But he was faithful, and he plugged into this community, and he built it up to a thriving congregation again, making the Boys and Girls Club to reach the community, creating these new ministry opportunities. And he laid the groundwork for future pastors that were going to come after him. Being faithful to the church, Pastor Dale Garrett is the longest standing missionary church pastor that we have had. And that was just his time as senior pastor. Then he comes back and he's a part of our congregation for many years after that, serving in ministry. But back way in the early foundations of our church, he establishes those things to lay that groundwork for the future generations. And then I love this quote from Pastor Dale Garrett. And I think this is phenomenal for leaving a legacy. So, if you've missed everything else that I've said, tune in now. Clear your mind, put down whatever your distraction is, turn up the TV, whatever it is that you need to do to focus on this. I love what Pastor Dale Garrett says. May God teach us the value of those precious moments and golden opportunities that are ours today and only today. Wow! That is so powerful for leaving a legacy. And if you are anything like me, and you take a step back and you reflect on your devotions with God, your work in ministry with God, and say, I got to do some restoring here. I need to revitalize. I need to be back on fire for what God is doing. I came across a poem in the research, and I talked about this on midweek, where it talked about when the Lord returns, where am I going to be? Am I going to be doing something that's of the Lord's work, or am I going to be doing something that's self-appeasing? Wow, that's an important thing to be contemplating. How much of the stuff are we doing for the Lord when the church is meeting for something? Not that we have to be there every single time the church is meeting, but are we motivated to do that, or do we just do something else because it's easier? I fall into that category. I have to admit, not doing midweek services sometimes is, I feel good about it, going, wow, I have time to do something else, to mow the lawn or get work done at the home. And that's kind of bad. There's times like, wow, but prayer is so important. And did I replace our Wednesday times at prayer at the church with praying at my home? No, I filled it with things of myself. So I realized, man, I got to restore. I need to go back. I read about how these people were meeting, 3 times a week at the church and having these long prayer meetings. And I look at my prayer life and go, wow, no wonder why they were doing great things back then, and I'm not doing near as well now. I have all these other distractions in my life, so I need to restore to be able to put on this legacy that's beneficial for future generations, to lay that groundwork. May I do what Dale Garrett said in this quote. May God teach me the value of those precious moments, those golden opportunities that are mine today and only today. I might not get them back. And that's the encouragement for you as well. You have opportunities that are before you today. They might be only there for today. Are you going to take advantage of those precious moments? Those opportunities to leave that legacy for those future generations, to do work that God is doing here on this earth. So our application. How does this apply to us today? More than a history lesson of Sturgis Missionary Church, more than hearing of the good qualities of those who have come before us. We want to ask ourselves, how do we want our lives to touch others? And what are we going to do to make that happen? I pray that you will be with me the remainder of this year and the coming years afterwards to commit to restoring, to making a legacy for the future generations that come after us. May we lay the groundwork for them to build upon, to be a part of what God is doing here now. Thank you so much for spending this time with me this week. And I look forward to getting with you again next week.